She thought the night would end there. A name exchanged, a moment acknowledged. Two people who once existed in the same world, now standing in the same room, pretending that meant nothing. But Nolan O'Connor was not the kind of man who let things end at almost. And Astrid, no matter how many times she told herself to walk away clean, was not as ready to disappear as she wanted to believe. What happens when the mask comes off and the real story begins? That's exactly where we are. If you're new here, subscribe and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Part 2 starts right now. They stood there for a moment that neither of them rushed. The party behind them had thinned. It was past 11, and the particular energy of the room had shifted from performance to wind down, guests collecting coats and finishing last drinks, with the slow reluctance of people who didn't want to admit the night was over. Astrid was not thinking about the night being over. She was thinking about the way Nolan was looking at her, like he was doing the same math she was, running the same quiet calculation of how this was possible, and what it meant, and what, if anything, came next. Astrid Adler, he said, and this time it wasn't a repetition. It was a full sentence. The kind that contains an entire history inside 2 words. You went to Harwick. It wasn't a question. Harwick Preparatory, the private school in Cambridge where they had both, apparently, spent 3 unremarkable years existing in the same building without ever really colliding. She remembered him now with the specific clarity of a memory that had been stored carefully without knowing why. Junior year, he sat 2 rows ahead in AP Literature, quiet in the way that confident people are quiet, not because they have nothing to say, but because they're selective about when they say it. She had noticed him the way you notice something you don't let yourself want. Briefly, repeatedly, never out loud. You were in Calloway's class, she said. 3rd period. Something in his expression shifted, pleased and trying not to show it. You remember that? I remember you never talked in discussion, she said. Calloway used to call on you specifically because of it. He liked making people uncomfortable. Did it work? On everyone else, he said, and the corner of his mouth moved in a way that was almost a smile, but landed closer to an admission. Astrid felt the full weight of the evening rearranging itself around this new information. He had recognized her the moment she walked in. He had crossed the room, asked her to dance, spent 3 hours in her orbit, all while knowing exactly who she was. And she had spent those same 3 hours feeling inexplicably at ease with a stranger who, it turned out, was never a stranger at all. The warmth she'd been feeling all evening curdled slightly at the edges, not into anger, into something more complicated, a mix of flattery and exposure that she didn't quite have language for yet. You knew the whole time, she said. Not an accusation, just a fact being laid on the table. He didn't flinch from it. I wasn't certain at first, he said. The mask, the hair. But then you laughed at that painting and He stopped, chose the next words carefully. I was certain after that. There it was, the laugh, the unguarded, private, completely unconscious laugh she'd given to a small aquarelle when she thought no one was paying attention. He had been paying attention, had apparently been paying attention in ways that went back further than tonight. Astrid looked at him for a long moment. The snow was still falling outside. The chandeliers above them had dimmed slightly as the event wound down, and in the softer light, he looked less like someone from a world she didn't belong to, and more like someone she had simply lost track of, which was, in its own way, more unsettling. I should find my friend, she said finally. It was true. It was also a small retreat, and they both knew it. He nodded. He didn't push. But as she turned to go, He said her name once more. Just that, nothing attached to it. And she felt it land somewhere in her chest, with a weight that had no business being there after a single evening. She didn't turn back around, but she slowed down, just for a step, just enough. Cleo was waiting near the coat check, with the specific expression of someone who had been patient for exactly as long as patience was interesting, and not a second longer. She handed Astrid her coat without a word, which meant she was saving the words for somewhere quieter. They made it half a block from the Hargrove before Cleo stopped walking. "Okay," she said. Talked. The snow was coming down steadily now, the kind that softened the edges of everything. Streetlights, parked cars, the particular sharpness of a Boston night in November. Astrid pulled her coat tighter and kept walking. "There's nothing to talk about. You disappeared for 3 hours with a man whose face should be in a museum, and you're telling me there's nothing to talk about?" "We danced." Astrid. "And talked?" "For 3 hours." "He's someone I went to school with," Astrid said. "We didn't know each other. He recognized me tonight." Cleo was quiet for exactly 3 seconds, which was how long it took her to process and reclassify the information. "He recognized you. At a masked ball. After years. Apparently. And then danced with you for 3 hours. You're going to keep saying 3 hours, aren't you? Until you understand what that means, yes." Astrid didn't answer because she was already thinking about it, had been thinking about it since she walked away from him, since she felt his voice say her name at her back like something with weight. She had not given him her number. He had not asked. The evening had ended in that specific, suspended way where both people know something is unfinished and neither one reaches for the thread. She told herself it was fine, clean even, a single strange night with a beginning and an end. She almost believed it until she got home, took off the burgundy dress, and found herself standing at her bathroom mirror, still thinking about the way he'd looked at her when she removed the mask. Not with surprise, with recognition, like he'd been waiting for exactly that. She didn't sleep well. Nolan, across the city, in the kind of apartment that looked out over the Charles River, with floor-to-ceiling windows, and the particular silence of a space that was expensive and orderly and not quite warm, wasn't sleeping either. He was sitting at his kitchen counter with a glass of water he hadn't touched, turning the evening over with the methodical attention he usually reserved for problems he needed to solve. Except this didn't feel like a problem. It felt like the opposite, like something that had been missing from a familiar room had been quietly returned to its place. And now the room looked correct again. And that should have been simple, but instead it made everything else feel slightly insufficient by comparison. He had her name. He knew where she worked. She'd told him about Meridian herself, without knowing she was handing him a map. He was aware that showing up there would be a choice with a direction, and that once made, it couldn't be walked back to neutral. He was also aware that he had been thinking about doing it since approximately the moment she slowed her step when he said her name. He picked up his phone, set it back down, picked it up again. He didn't call anyone. He just held it, looking at the river, thinking about a woman who laughed at an unnamed painting in a crowded room and made 3 hours feel like 20 minutes. By morning, he had made his decision. He just hadn't told her yet. Meridian Contemporary was the kind of gallery that smelled like possibility and fresh paint, and the faint anxiety of a staff that cared too much about things that didn't pay enough. It occupied the ground floor of a narrow brownstone on Tremont Street, with wide front windows that let the winter light in at a flat, honest angle that was perfect for the work and unflattering for everyone standing in it. Astrid loved it unreasonably. She arrived Tuesday morning 20 minutes early, which was normal, made the first pot of coffee, which was also normal, and spent the first hour of her shift rearranging the placement notes for the spring exhibition with a focus that was slightly too intense for a Tuesday, which was less normal, but explainable if you didn't look too closely. She had not heard from Nolan. This was fine. She had not expected to. They had exchanged names and histories and approximately 3 hours of the kind of conversation that feels significant in the moment and then gets quietly filed under anomaly in the sober light of the following morning. She was good at filing things. She had gotten very good at it in the last year. By noon, she had convinced herself, almost completely, that the evening was simply a good story she would tell Cleo in pieces over the next several weeks. Then, the front door opened, and Nolan O'Connor walked into her gallery, like he had looked up the address, considered the implications, and come anyway. He was different in daylight. Not less attractive. If anything, the absence of the formal event context made him more tangible, more present. Dark coat, no tie, the same pale green eyes that had watched her across a ballroom, now adjusting to the quiet white light of the gallery, with an expression that was calm and slightly uncertain in equal measure. He saw her immediately. She was standing behind the front desk, with a placement note in one hand and absolutely no composure left in the other. "Hi," he said. It was such a plain word for the size of the moment that she almost laughed. "Hi," she managed. He looked around briefly, taking in the space with genuine attention, not the performative appreciation of someone buying time. His gaze moved across the walls slowly, the way hers had moved across the aquarelle at the gala. And something about watching him do that loosened the knot in her chest just slightly. "This is good," he said, meaning the gallery, meaning the work on the walls. The Reyes piece especially. She glanced at the photograph he'd stopped on, one of the interior series, an empty kitchen with afternoon light pooling on the floor like something spilled and left. "She's in the spring show," Astrid said. "Larger scale." He nodded, still looking at it. "I'd like to see that." The air between them had the specific charge of two people being careful, not cold, just deliberate. He had shown up. That was already a statement. She hadn't told him to leave. That was hers. "You looked up the address," she said. Not an accusation, just naming the thing. He turned to look at her then, direct and unhurried. "You told me about this place like it mattered to you," he said. "It does," she said. "I know," he said simply. And then, with the same quiet confidence that had asked her to dance without making it a demand, "Have lunch with me. Nothing complicated, just lunch." Astrid looked at him for a long moment. The gallery was empty except for the two of them. The winter light came through the front windows at its flat, honest angle. She thought about the painting, the figure at the edge, both options still open. "Okay," she said. And just like that, the story stopped being about one night. Lunch was at a small Italian place 3 blocks from the gallery. His suggestion, her approval, a place with no dress code, and genuinely good bread, and tables close enough together that you kept your voice at a human volume. It was nothing like the Hargrove Hotel. That was, Astrid suspected, intentional. They settled across from each other in a corner booth, coats piled beside them, menus neither of them looked at for very long. The waiter brought water and bread and left them alone, with the specific discretion of someone who could read a table. Outside, Boston moved through its Tuesday at full pace. Cabs, pedestrians, the distant percussion of a construction site 2 streets over. In here, things were slower. "You seem surprised I picked somewhere like this," he said, watching her take in the room. "I didn't say anything." "You had a face." She looked at him. "I don't have a face." "You have several, actually," he said. "I've been cataloging them." The directness of it caught her off guard, and she felt the warmth move up the back of her neck in a way she hoped wasn't visible. It probably was. He had the kind of attention that noticed things before you'd decided to show them. Over the next hour, lunch became the kind of conversation that makes you forget you're eating. They talked about Harwick, the parts of it that had been useful and the parts that hadn't, the particular social ecosystem of a private school that prepared you excellently for certain rooms and not at all for others. He was funny in a dry, unhurried way that she hadn't fully caught at the gala, where everything had been slightly formal at the edges. Here, without the Aventa scaffolding, he was more relaxed. More himself, she thought. And more himself was harder to maintain a safe distance from. She told him about her brother, Marcus, who lived in Portland, and called her every Sunday with the specific energy of someone who thought she needed more chaos in her life. Nolan listened with full attention, asking questions that built on each other, and she noticed, with the part of her brain that was still taking notes, even while the rest of her was simply enjoying herself, that he never redirected the conversation back to himself unless she asked. Which she did. He had grown up mostly in Boston, he told her. His father ran an investment firm. His mother had died when he was 19. He said it plainly, without performing grief, just placing it on the table as a fact that had shaped the floor plan of his life. Astrid didn't offer a pivot or a condolence. She just said, "That's a hard age to lose someone." And he looked at her with something that suggested the simplicity of her response was exactly right. The bread was gone. The coffee had arrived without either of them ordering it, which meant the waiter had been paying more attention than he'd let on. Outside, the afternoon light had shifted, softer, lower, the particular gold of a Boston winter afternoon that didn't last long enough. Nolan reached across the table and tucked a loose strand of her hair back from her face. It was a small gesture, unhurried and entirely natural, and it stopped the conversation completely. His fingers barely grazed her cheekbone. She didn't move away. The air between them contracted. His eyes held hers with the steady, undisguised warmth of someone who had stopped pretending he wasn't exactly where he wanted to be. "I should get back," she said softly. "I know," he said. But neither of them reached for their coats. They walked back to the gallery slowly, which was a choice neither of them named out loud. The afternoon had gone gold and thin, the way Boston afternoons do in late November. The light cutting low across the brick facades and making everything look slightly more significant than it probably was. Their shoulders were close enough that the sleeves of their coats brushed with every other step. Small contact, consistent. Neither of them adjusted. Astrid was doing the thing she did when something felt too good to trust, cataloging reasons for caution. He lived in a different world. Not metaphorically, literally. The kind of apartment that looked over the Charles. The ease with which he occupied spaces that cost money just to stand in. These were not small differences. She had spent 2 years with a man who had made her feel like a guest in her own relationship, and she had promised herself, in the specific quiet of the months after, that she would not again mistake someone's confidence for safety. But Nolan wasn't performing anything. That was the problem. She could work with performance. She knew how to see through it, how to keep the right distance from it. What she didn't have a reliable system for was someone who was simply, consistently, genuinely present. He stopped walking half a block from the gallery. She stopped too, turning to look at him with the question already on her face. "I need to tell you something," he said. His tone had shifted, still calm, but with an undercurrent of something more deliberate. She waited. "At Harwick," he started. "Junior year. Calloway's class." She nodded slowly. "There was a presentation, end of semester. You did yours on Wolf. Not the obvious Wolf, not the one everyone did. You wrote about the marginalia, the things she wrote in the edges of other people's books. Astrid felt something very still move through her. She remembered that presentation. She had been nervous and talked too fast and thought, afterward, that no one had really been listening. I've thought about that presentation more times than makes any reasonable sense, he said. I never said anything to you. I don't know why. Probably because I was 17 and significantly less brave than I currently am. The honesty of it was almost architectural, clean, load-bearing, no decoration. She looked at him standing on that sidewalk in the thin afternoon light, hands in his coat pockets, watching her with the particular patience of someone who had already accepted whatever came next. She felt the wall she'd been quietly maintaining develop a crack. Not collapse, just a crack. That was a very good presentation, she said finally, and her voice came out softer than she intended. The corner of his mouth moved. It was, he agreed. I've been meaning to tell you for approximately 10 years. They stood there for a moment in the cold, the city moving around them with complete indifference to the fact that something was shifting between two people on a sidewalk in the South End. Then she did something she hadn't planned. She reached out and straightened the lapel of his coat, a small adjustment, barely necessary, her fingers resting against the wool for just a second longer than the gesture required. He looked down at her hand and then back at her face, and didn't say anything, which was exactly right. I have to go back in, she said. I know, he said. She turned toward the gallery door. Nolan, he looked at her. Call me, she said, simply, directly, like someone who had decided. He nodded once, and the way he did it, quiet and certain, suggested he had been waiting for exactly that permission without ever planning to ask for it. He called that same evening, not a text, an actual call, which she noticed because nobody called anymore, and he seemed like exactly the kind of person who understood that distinction. She was on her couch with a bowl of soup she'd been meaning to eat for 40 minutes when her phone lit up with a number she'd saved that afternoon under simply Nolan, because anything more felt presumptuous and anything less felt dishonest. She answered on the second ring, which was intentional. I wasn't sure you'd pick up, he said. I wasn't sure I would either, she admitted. He laughed softly, and she pulled her knees up to her chest and settled in, the soup going fully cold and completely forgotten. They talked for 2 hours, about nothing urgent, about everything that mattered. He told her about a trip to Iceland he'd taken alone 2 years ago, how the silence there had a different texture than anywhere else he'd been. She told him about the summer she'd spent cataloging a private collection in Providence, how she'd found a small, unsigned oil painting behind a larger one, and spent 3 weeks trying to figure out who made it. Did you ever find out? He asked. No, she said. But I think about her sometimes, whoever she was, painting something and then hiding it behind something else. The line was quiet for a moment. Why do you think she hid it? I don't know, Astrid said. Maybe it was too honest. Maybe she wasn't ready for anyone to see it yet. Another pause, warmer this time. I know that feeling, he said quietly. And the way he said it made her chest do something inconvenient and completely beyond her control. They made plans for Friday. Dinner, his suggestion, a place in the back bay she'd walked past 100 times without going in. She said yes without deliberating, which was new. After she hung up, she sat in her quiet apartment for a long moment, the city humming faintly outside, and let herself feel it, the specific, fragile warmth of something beginning. She didn't try to talk herself out of it. Not tonight. Friday arrived with the particular cruelty of days you're looking forward to, slow until suddenly it wasn't. He picked her up at the gallery at 7, which meant her coworker Dana saw him through the front window and said absolutely nothing, but communicated volumes with her eyebrows. Dinner was easy and warm and ran long in the best way. Walking back through the back bay afterward, the streets quiet under a clear November sky, he took her hand. Not dramatically, just reached over and held it. And she let him, and that was that. On her doorstep, he turned to face her, close enough that she could see the way the streetlight caught the pale green of his eyes. He tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, the same gesture from the restaurant, but slower this time, more deliberate, his fingers trailing lightly along her jaw before dropping away. "Can I see you this weekend?" he asked. "Yes," she said. And then he kissed her, soft and unhurried, one hand curved at her jaw, the city entirely irrelevant around them. It was the kind of kiss that didn't rush toward anything. It was complete in itself, present and warm and careful in the way that things are careful when they actually matter. She felt it in her shoulders, her hands, somewhere behind her sternum. When he pulled back, he rested his forehead briefly against hers. Neither of them said anything. They didn't need to. She went inside, leaned against the closed door for a moment in the dark hallway, eyes closed, heart doing things. If this story has been living in your chest the way it's been living in mine, drop a number in the comments. 1 to 10. No explanation needed. Just let me know it landed. And thank you, genuinely, for showing up, for listening, for staying until the end. These stories only exist because you're here. I'll see you in part 3.